1776 was an important year for both the Americans and the British. The American War for Independence had already destroyed many parts of the northern colonies and Canada. Trade routes had been disrupted, and the fabric of the global order was beginning to shift. Before the big campaigns of 1777 begin, I think it's important to take a look at the political situation from both sides in order to establish a better context for the events that will unfold very soon. For the Americans, 1776 was mostly a disaster. The beginning of the year started with the conclusion of the disastrous Quebec Campaign. Disaster was only totally averted due to some quick thinking by Benedict Arnold, but for the most part it was an all-around, complete and utter failure. In New York, Washington's army was totally demolished, and the fledgling nation had just lost access to one of its biggest cities and ports, along with over half of the army sent to guard it. But the end of the year hadn't been too bad. There was indeed a silver lining. Washington's unorthodox attack during Christmas had forced the British to largely pull out of New Jersey, and had safeguarded the American capital in Philadelphia. Washington was in hot water before this, but his success had bought both himself and his new nation precious time. The American armed forces had bent, but were not yet broken, and they would not break, at least in the near future. For the Continental Congress, the main goal was, of course, winning the war. Perhaps its greatest need was the raising of additional forces. This they did accomplish, and over the early months of 1777, new units of regular and militia troops were dispatched to reinforce the armies in the field. Yet, the biggest goal for the Americans laid tantalizingly out of reach. They needed foreign support. While the French and the Spanish had been covertly sending war material, there still was no main ally for the nation. They needed someone with a lot of manpower and a powerful navy. The American goal this upcoming year was to stabilize their front lines, push the British off of American soil, and to secure foreign military support. On the British side, 1776 was one of great success. When war had broken out, the British government had understood that the process of waging war against the colonies would not be a short endeavor. Rather, it would be a long-term engagement. I already mentioned this in a previous video about Washington's New Jersey campaign, but the British had begun to mobilize German soldiers to help subsidize their manpower in the colonies. They had to garrison their whole empire, and were stretched thin. Things had almost become disastrous when the Americans were marching on Quebec City. The quick thinking by Guy Carleton had not stopped their advance. Things had become almost disastrous when the Americans were marching on Quebec City. The quick thinking by Guy Carleton had not just stopped their advance, but had pushed them all the way back to the Hudson Valley. This, combined with the capture of New York earlier in the year, created great staging grounds for attacks into the heartland and increased morale. See, unlike the Americans, the British involvement and victory in this war heavily relied on public opinion. As long as the public was on board, they could continue, and the only way for this would be if they could continue their string of victories. The British goals were this: split the colonies to end the rebellion, capture Washington's army, capture the rebel capital, and prevent any foreign actors from intervening. As we enter 1777, the year that could very well become the turning point of this war, both sides equipped themselves for what might be. Though, unlike last year, it would be the British, not the Americans, who would make the first attack. The North American continent was no stranger to conflict. Not even 20 years before the breakout of the American Revolution, there was a massive war on the continent. The same war that saw France lose Quebec and that sowed the seeds of rebellion in the colonies. The 7 Years' War, as it's known internationally, or the French and Indian War as it's known here in the States, was the culmination of a geopolitical rivalry between Great Britain and France. The two nations have fought many different wars over the many different centuries, dating back to the Norman conquest of the island. While the two had fought devastating conflicts in the past, the 7 Years' War was truly on a different level in terms of scale and destruction. British and French troops fought each other all over the world, and the final peace saw the British cement itself as the preeminent power on the world stage. France lost most of its possessions in the New World and India, firmly landing it in a secondary power role. The loss of territory, prestige, and economic revenue spurred the French towards the British, and there was indeed a deeply held desire for revenge. This was the context of the country when Benjamin Franklin made his trip to the country to seek help for the revolution. While to many, Benjamin Franklin might have seemed like an interesting choice, to say the least, to be the ambassador to France, he was chosen for the job because of his reputation as somewhat of a Renaissance man. Among other things, Franklin was known as a writer, scientist, political philosopher, and inventor. Importantly for the Revolution, Franklin helped to write the Declaration of Independence and signed the document as well. He was very much one of the faces of the Revolution, and the face abroad. His noteworthiness made him the best ambassador to France that could have been chosen from the likely candidates. When he arrived in France, Franklin immediately began to court the nobility and argue the American side. He used his persona and reputation to gain the respect of the French upper class. Eventually, Franklin gained the attention of King Louis XVI. Over the next few months, Franklin argued first that the American Revolution was the fulfillment of the Enlightenment ways of thinking. The Enlightenment had spread through the French aristocracy and court. Many of them said that they believed in it, but the reality is that it was really just to be trendy, to be in touch with how the common people thought. I hope you could tell that I said that with the biggest eye roll in existence. Regardless of how insincere the beliefs of the aristocracy were, Franklin's appeals worked. The French, slowly but surely, began to not only feel sympathetic, but also began to advocate for helping the Americans in their struggle. The king and his ministers, though, were harder to sell. While they held the same beliefs in the Enlightenment, France had just lost a war to the British less than 20 years ago, a loss that saw them give up most of their worldwide empire and a loss that they had just been recovering from financially. Initially, the French agreed to send munitions, weapons, and supplies to the rebels, but refused to send actual troops or naval assistance. Simply put, France wanted plausible deniability and did not want to get involved in another long war with the British. Franklin continued to push, though, and wrote back to the Continental Congress that the French would consider intervening officially on the American side if they could prove that they could defeat the British in open battle. At the moment, Washington had just defeated the British forces in New Jersey, but had stopped campaigning for the winter. While the victories in Trenton and Princeton were important for the war effort and probably saved the nation, the absolute failure to defend New York hung heavy over the minds of the French and other European leaders. This success finally occurred when news reached France that General Horatio Gates had not only defeated John Burgoyne's army at Saratoga, but had utterly destroyed it. This single moment changed everything. King Louis XVI summoned Franklin and informed him that the Kingdom of France would be declaring war on Great Britain. Within a few months, the French Navy began moving troops over the Atlantic. The Royal Navy suddenly had to worry about more than just small groups of American raiders and sloops. The scales on both the ocean and land were now much more balanced. Franklin was not done, though. Things were about to get even worse for the British. France wasn't the only country that he was convincing to join the war. In March of 1777, the Spanish also began to smuggle weapons and supplies to the Americas through the port of New Orleans, which was then part of Spanish America. Later that year, John Jay, a rising star in American politics, was assigned to the Continental Congress to be their ambassador to the Spanish court. It was his job to convince the Spanish to officially enter the war. While Spain was technically on the losing side of the 7 Years' War, they gained control of the former French territory west of the Mississippi River in exchange for giving up Florida to the British. Spain also gave up Gibraltar at the extreme southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula. So while not as bad as France, Spain was still very bitter towards the British. Franklin sent letters to the Spanish, encouraging them to join the war on the side of the colonies. After much discussion, the Spanish decided to join the war, except not as allies of the Americans. Instead, they would be co-belligerents, fighting alongside the French against the British. While in reality, the Spanish were now fighting alongside the Americans, even providing them with more munitions and supplies. This distinction of being a co-belligerent instead of being an ally is important and gives us an insight into the strategic goal of the European powers in this war. Both the Spanish and the French believed that by getting involved in the war, they would do three things. First, weaken British power across the world. Second, the return of their previously lost territories lost during the 7 Years' War. And third, they wanted to be able to prevent a newly independent American state from being too powerful. To them, it was important to have a moderately powerful state that they could trade with and be a geopolitical counterweight to British influence in North America. But they also foresaw that a truly massive American state could become a geopolitical powerhouse, much the same as the European powers. And in hindsight, this revelation was almost prophetic. Spain was especially concerned with this, given the fact that they controlled vast territories in the New World, an immensely powerful American state with a center of gravity across the Atlantic, in whatever form that might be, could threaten Spanish dominance, where they extracted most of their wealth. These concerns made it important that when the time came for negotiations, the French and the Spanish needed to be seen as the leader of the warring faction, so that way they could dictate the peace that was to come. Because of Benjamin Franklin's masterstroke of diplomacy, by 1779, the British Empire was now at war, not just on the North American continent with its rebelling colonies, but with two worldwide empires. Not only had the American Revolution ballooned in size, but also in expanse. For the war to continue, the British would need a knockout blow somewhere. It was decided by the British military command that this knockout blow would take place in the rebelling colonies. Word was sent to begin mobilizing the British soldiers overseas and to take a fight to a new theater. The British would strike south. The Quebec Campaign of 1776 was an unmitigated disaster that saw the near total loss of an American army and was barely saved by the frantic defense of the Hudson Valley by Benedict Arnold. Over the winter, both sides repaired, refitted, and prepared for the impending campaign. Typically, I like to start the episode out from the perspective of the American forces, but today we're going to start out not with Benedict Arnold, but instead with John Burgoyne. John Burgoyne was the savior of Canada. His arrival with new forces had driven the Americans from the gates of Quebec City and all the way back into New York. He may have even been able to capture the Hudson Valley had Benedict Arnold not done a successful fighting withdrawal. Sure, the end of the campaign wasn't the success that he had wanted, but all in all, his counterattack was extremely successful. As the winter ended, Burgoyne wanted to do more than just capture the Hudson Valley. He wanted to strike a knockout blow against the rebellion. He submitted his plans of attack to the British High Command in February of 1777, and soon received the go-ahead to commence. This is what he had in mind. Burgoyne would split his army into two parts. The large one, led by himself, consisting of about 7,200 soldiers, would push down the Hudson Valley to capture American forts, the most important one being Fort Ticonderoga. The smaller branch would head towards Albany, New York, from the west, consisting of about 1,800 soldiers. They would advance in tandem and meet back up at Albany and defeat a battered and depleted rebel army. At the same time, Burgoyne called for General Howe in New York to feint an attack north of the city to pin down American forces. The hope was that by the end of the year, the communications between New England and the southern colonies would be cut, and the rebellion would be split into two. British rationale at the time was that the New England colonies were where the most fervent revolutionary spirit was. If they could isolate that part away from the southern colonies, who appeared to be more loyalist, then perhaps it would be possible to end the rebellion more swiftly. Additionally, if surprise could be established, the American army that Benedict Arnold commanded at the time could be completely destroyed, and Washington would be totally cut off from the Northeast. This plan, if successful, could very much end the rebellion in 1777 at the earliest, or at the latest, mid-1778. I'll give it to Burgoyne. This was certainly a cunning and audacious plan. There are three problems, though, that I want to point out before we go any further. The first being that it called for the splitting of his army into two. Another issue that Burgoyne faced was the lack of intelligence and understanding both of where the position of the American forces and their composition. He knew that Arnold was out there, somewhere, but not his exact location. The lack of intelligence wasn't the worst thing. This could be remedied by scouting. The biggest glaring problem is that Burgoyne was extremely arrogant. He felt that he would be able to easily dispatch any rebel forces that he might encounter. It's understandable why he would feel this way, given what happened in Quebec, but the worst thing you can ever be as a military commander is arrogant. His final mistake was relying on Howe. The men didn't always get along too well, and so to rely on orders that he created that essentially makes Howe follow his orders was going to ruffle some feathers. What Burgoyne also did not know was that Howe's plan had also been sent to military high command and was also approved. Howe asked permission to make a push towards the city of Philadelphia, the rebel capital. His plans were also approved. So, if you're not following, Burgoyne was now relying on the assistance of a man who he didn't have the best relationship with, and who also just had his own separate command approved of. He thought the entire campaign that he would be receiving the aid of another phantom army. This will come back to bite him. On the flip side, the Americans had no clue what the British were planning. Intelligence was all over the place. Washington was aware of the situation and considered his options. He guessed that an attack centered around Burgoyne's army in the Hudson was the most likely scenario, but where exactly he would strike, or when, was the mystery. Although he did correctly point out that the center of gravity up there is Albany, so good on him. To put into perspective how faulty the intelligence was, the Continental Congress wrote to Washington that they believed that John Burgoyne was not going to strike through the Hudson Valley, and instead planned on sailing around the coast, landing in his rear to outflank him. On a side note, or I guess spoiler alert, if you don't want to know, skip ahead. This intelligence was actually really spot on, except they believed that it would be Burgoyne to do this. It was actually the plan of General Howe. So, I digress. With this faulty intelligence, Washington made probably the safest call possible. He ordered the reinforcement of the forts in the Mohawk Valley to the west and in the Hudson Valley. This is actually the exact places where Burgoyne was going to attack, so he guessed quite well. Washington dispatched about 3,500 fresh troops to the region to shore up its defenses. The outcome of the intelligence given to Washington by the Continental Congress, though, will be the topic of another video, so stay tuned then. We're not done with Washington yet. It was at this point that American General Philip Schuyler returned to command after being ill for some time. He also received reinforcements commanded by General Israel Putnam, a name you might remember from the Battle of Bunker Hill and the Siege of Boston. The trap was set, and now it needed someone to spring it. After many months of preparation, in early June, John Burgoyne launched his offensive. When I say launch, I should really say it was a crawl. His baggage train was over 3 miles, or nearly 5 kilometers, long. His soldiers were not equipped to fight and march through wilderness, and the whole time, the Continental forces were sabotaging the march. Whether it be from the occasional skirmish, the destruction of bridges, the felling of trees, or the lack of livestock to be plundered, this all made for quite a miserable march. While the Americans knew where Burgoyne's army was, they still didn't know its target. This is because of the Native American scouts that Burgoyne had employed as the vanguard of his army, and they did a great job of masking his exact movements. So, you can imagine the surprise of General Arthur St. Clair when he and his 3,000 men defending Fort Ticonderoga were suddenly partially surrounded and had artillery pounding their positions from the higher ground near the fort. The surprise and lack of preparation for the attack led to a swift retreat from the region. In 4 days, Burgoyne's army had taken the largest fortress on the Hudson River. While his retreat caused political turmoil, St. Clair's quick thinking had saved most of his army. While he had lost the fort in some small skirmishes, most of his army retreated back through what is today the present state of Vermont, back towards Schuyler's positions further downstream at Albany. This will have major implications for the future of this campaign. So, rather than making a lightning advance and pressing the attack on what appeared to be a wide open road towards Albany, Burgoyne decided to rest a few days, and then totally overhauled his plans, and then, after some time, began to march again. This time, though, their advance would be that of an incredibly slow crawl. The delaying tactics that I first mentioned were sent into overdrive now that the Americans knew exactly where Burgoyne was and exactly where he was going. Burgoyne made extremely slow progress over the next month, and he was even forced to build his own road through the wilderness after the colonists kept cutting down the trees in his path, and that made it even more annoying to go through in March. This was extremely time-consuming. Even still, he continued to push his men towards Albany. These weren't all the British troops on the advance, though. Remember how he had sent a large contingent of about 1,700 men to march through western New York to meet up with him at Albany? Let's see how they're doing. Lieutenant Colonel St. Leger was leading his forces through the Mohawk Valley in western New York. Importantly for this story, about half of his men were Native American warriors from the surrounding Iroquois tribes. They knew the terrain very well, and like what happened with Burgoyne, were excellent scouts and guides. This column made good progress towards their objective, even routing an American force at the siege of Fort Stanwix. Their march was stopped, however, at Oriskany by the American forces. While the Americans forced the British from the field, they had received such horrific casualties that they also had to pull back, making this a draw. Sensing that this could have been a breaking point, Benedict Arnold immediately raised men and marched towards Fort Stanwix with about 100, and intended on rallying the surviving Americans after their commander had been mortally wounded. While this number was small, and Arnold knew it was very small, he used some clever deception and convinced the British that he had a much larger army. News of this march reached St. Leger, and his native allies deserted him very quickly, and even took most of their supplies with them. Seeing the writing on the wall, and believing that his battered forces were now facing down a very, very powerful American force, St. Leger began his long retreat back towards Canada. Remember defeat in detail? A British army that started out with 10,000 men had split themselves up, and now 1,700 of those men were now defeated, scattered, or were having to retreat to redeploy over a months-long march. This was a big success. Benedict Arnold turned his forces right around and marched quickly to reinforce Schuyler's army at Albany. Back in Paradise, Burgoyne's situation began to grow worse somehow. He had sent word to General Howe in New York asking him how his march from New York City was going. He was assuming that he was going to meet up with him at Albany soon, and that their overwhelming force would crush the American forces there. He sent this letter in early June when he began his march to Albany. He opened the reply in early August as he was making his own roads through the New York wilderness. So, he had been marching for over a month. He expected to see that Howe was close by, and that the urgently needed supplies that he needed would be right around the corner. So you can imagine his surprise when he opened the letter to learn that not only was Howe not on his way, but that he had instead decided to go and box Washington in Philadelphia. I really wish I could go back in time and hear his reaction. Burgoyne's panic was apparently so bad that he did not share with his officers this development until the campaign had already progressed much further than this point. Knowing that he now needed to secure a new source of supply, he divided his army again and dispatched 1,000 soldiers under the command of Colonel Friedrich Baum to go into what is present-day Vermont and raid a few towns and bring back supplies. What he did not know is that that force commanded by General St. Clair, who he had pushed out of Ticonderoga, had now reinforced and rebuilt his army. When Baum left, he was soon surrounded and annihilated at the Battle of Bennington. To make matters even worse, his native allies, seeing the writing on the wall, left him as well. By the beginning of August, Burgoyne was now left with 7,000 men and no supplies. The Americans were not idle, though. The Continental Congress had dispatched General Horatio Gates to take over command from Schuyler. Gates was very arrogant, and the difference between him and Schuyler could be felt immediately. When he arrived, he refused to include Schuyler in his war council, and did not want to use him in the preparations for his own campaign. Gates in the Continental Congress saw Schuyler as incompetent for giving up Ticonderoga. Eventually, Washington recalled Schuyler back to him in preparation for Howe's advance on Philadelphia, though more on that in a later video. Gates continued to grow his army. His numbers were bolstered by militia, Arnold's army arriving from the west, General Lincoln's fresh companies, and the army from Bennington. Gates' army now numbered more than 10,000 men. They received fresh supplies as well. He also received a Polish man by the name of Tadeusz Kosciuszko. Kosciuszko hailed from Poland and was in charge of setting up the defense works. He picked a series of hills and had the soldiers create trenches, gun emplacements, and other obstacles. This American army was well provisioned, well supplied, and well dug in just south of Saratoga, New York. Burgoyne had no clue what he was walking into. He still believed that he'd be receiving supplies when his detachment of men returned. When Burgoyne arrived at the American lines, he arrived in force and immediately slammed into the American left flank. He realized that if he could break through there and roll it backwards, he could outflank the rest of the men in quick order, although he did not know exactly how large his army was he was facing. His three columns fought viciously and eventually forced the Americans to begin to pull back, though they did not fall back as far as he needed. Gates's men retreated to more lines behind them, and while bending, they importantly did not break. By the end of the day, the British had captured their objective, but had lost so many men that their newly captured positions were untenable. Burgoyne ordered them and the rest of the army to fall back towards Saratoga to regroup and receive the reinforcements he believed were arriving soon. He had received word that General Clinton, who Howe had left in New York, was launching an attack up the Hudson from the south that would at least peel off some American soldiers, and hopefully they would arrive, give him the supplies, and they could surround the American army. Clinton had major successes at the beginning. His 3,000 men made their way up the Hudson, and he was sending letters to Burgoyne to hold out just a little longer because he was making good progress. He was, though, eventually turned around and forced to retreat. All of his letters to Burgoyne, telling him that he was retreating, though, were intercepted and never reached him. Realizing now that help probably wasn't going to be able to get there quick enough, Burgoyne made plans to retreat. What he didn't realize was that the Americans were planning a massive attack. On the afternoon of October 7th, Burgoyne launched a 1,700-man reconnaissance in force mission to test out the American lines to see if they were still there. These 1,700 men slammed into the left flank of the American army, which by now was advancing on his position with 15,000 men. During the fighting, General Fraser, one of Burgoyne's most trusted men and one of his very good friends, was mortally wounded. All sides of his forces began to buckle under the immense and overwhelming force in front of him. He ordered a retreat to his entrenchments near Saratoga, but his messenger was shot dead in front of him. The British continued to fall back, but took increasingly high casualties. They did make it to 2 defensive redoubts, and their lines appeared to be holding now. This was until Benedict Arnold rode in, leading a charge of American forces. These defensive redoubts were held by some Canadian irregulars that had been raised from Canada, and they were decimated. Their final breakthrough forced the British to fully retreat back to Saratoga in haste. By the end of the day, the British had lost 900 men compared to the 150 lost for the Americans. Burgoyne now had an army of about 5,700 against an American army that now numbered 16,000 men. He was outnumbered 3-1. Realizing that he was now out of options, hopelessly outnumbered, out of supplies, and that no help was coming, he authorized retreat of his army all the way back to Canada. Perhaps he would be able to reach Fort Ticonderoga, where there was a sizable British garrison. He could replenish some of his numbers there and hold a great defensive position. He may have to retreat and give up most of his gains, but Saratoga would be about as far north as he would go. He also received word that St. Leger's army was making its way through Canada to reinforce him. Perhaps they could meet up at Ticonderoga. His army could then probably hit about 8,000 to 9,000 troops, and defending would be much easier. His retreat would spell doom for this campaign into New York for this year, but holding the upper Hudson and keeping Ticonderoga would make sure that the rebels couldn't reinvade Canada and would pin down troops that Washington desperately needed in Pennsylvania. He could still count this as a victory. Perhaps he could try again next spring. He reached Saratoga to grab his garrison and head north. He was met, though, with the news that there would be no retreat. American forces had moved around his flanks and cut his army off. He was surrounded. While Burgoyne's army was fighting south of Saratoga, General Lincoln had raised 2,000 troops and marched around him to attack Fort Ticonderoga. He didn't take the fort, but successfully closed off the passages of supply and communication from it to Burgoyne. He received a letter from Gates telling him about the fighting that there was in Saratoga, and he immediately marched south to pen in Burgoyne. On October 17th, 5 months after the beginning of this campaign, John Burgoyne became the first British general to surrender a British army in modern history. He marched out of Saratoga with his 6,000 men with full military honors, and into their imprisonment in Virginia. It's hard to overstate how important the victory at Saratoga was then and still is now. The ripple effects of this single battle can still be felt today. With Burgoyne's army out of the field, the predicament for the British Empire in North America became very tenuous. Canada once again became vulnerable, and it became very clear that the revolution would not be over anytime soon. The war would go on, and it would be costly in both men and material. For the Americans, this battle came at a time when the very survival of the nation was at stake. For the people involved, though, things were not all well. Something that will be, again, covered in another video. For a brief second, the Continental Congress could take a sigh of relief. But things were happening across the ocean. Now all eyes turned towards France. After dispatching reinforcements to the Hudson Valley to assist in the defense of John Burgoyne's impending push south, George Washington looked to take a breather and reconsolidate his position in New Jersey. His short but effective campaign in the southern part of the eventual state had forced the British back to the outskirts of New York. Given the right preparation, perhaps he would be able to take back the city. His position, though, was tenuous. Given Burgoyne's attack down the Hudson, it was completely possible that General Howe in New York would swing northward and trap the American forces in Albany. It was also completely possible that Howe would muster his forces and meet Washington head-on to capture New Jersey and potentially head south. There was also the possibility that Howe would march towards the northeast and attempt to capture Boston from the land. There was another outside possibility that Howe would attack Philadelphia with the British Navy, though this was totally an outside chance and would never happen, so why even prepare for it? Given all the different circumstances, George Washington had to be prepared to pivot his army to respond to any move by Howe. Things became clear, though, on where the possible targets could be: Albany, New York, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, or the New England coastline. In April of 1777, British General Charles Cornwallis began to raid some of the Continental Army's forward outposts near New Brunswick. Washington was camped out at Morristown and sent out reinforcements. As the frequency of the raids began to pick up, Washington concluded that Howe was indeed going to attack through New Jersey, and given his position, he could perhaps surprise him by marching there now and catching his army unaware. Washington moved his army to occupy the extremely defensible terrain of Middlebrook, which was nestled in the Watchung Mountains. This position was well fortified and oversaw any road to Pennsylvania. If Howe wanted to go through the capital, it would have to be along this road, and he would have to fight against Washington's powerful force that was dug in. Then, Washington received word that Howe was moving to Somerset Courthouse. He waited. He wouldn't take that bait. Howe then pulled his army back towards Perth Amboy, and Washington launched his attack. Thinking that Howe was caught unaware, the American force had advanced. There was a significant clash at the Battle of Short Hills, and the British were pushed back towards Perth Amboy even more. When Washington and his men arrived, they found nothing. See, earlier in the campaign, American spies had told Washington that Howe was constructing watercraft, but he did not have the men or material to work with. Obviously, this was completely wrong. Washington pulled his army back towards the center of New Jersey, though not before executing an unsuccessful raid on Staten Island, and decided to think this through. At this point in time, Burgoyne's campaign towards Albany was progressing, albeit very slowly. The most likely scenario was that Howe had used Cornwallis to mask his movements and had constructed a fleet to sail up the Hudson and pin the Americans in Albany. Indeed, this was the most likely scenario, and Washington prepared his men to march north. There was also the possibility that Howe was instead going to sail around New Jersey, up the Delaware, and land behind him to outflank his army and then destroy it. This too seemed possible, given that the British had left a sizable garrison in New York City. For now, he would wait to see where Howe showed up. He sent scouts to the mouth of the Delaware River and waited. In a few weeks' time, Howe showing up or failing to show up would tell him all he needed to know. Soon, he had his answer. Howe's ships had been sighted at the Delaware River, but did not enter it. This puzzled Washington. The only idea he had was that Howe was instead sailing to Charleston in South Carolina, the largest port in the South. He sent word to prepare to defend the city and began to pack up, anticipating that he would fight a fall campaign in the South. Then he received news that utterly stupefied him. Howe's fleet had stopped going south and instead was now heading up the Chesapeake Bay and into the Chesapeake River. There was no secret about where the target was. Howe had sailed around him and was headed right towards Philadelphia. Washington had his army pack up and march south at a blistering pace. He was stumped as to why Howe hadn't attacked north to help Burgoyne, or why he had not solidified his gain in New Jersey. His speculation had to wait though. For now, he needed to get to Philadelphia, and really fast. While Washington is headed south, let's talk about General Howe. I previously mentioned in the video about the Saratoga Campaign that John Burgoyne had floated the idea that Howe should meet up with him at Albany. He believed in this plan and thought it was going to come to fruition, and that's why he launched his campaign with all that in mind. Howe, though, had no plans on joining Burgoyne's escapades, and instead had used the spring and summer to launch diversionary attacks to draw Washington out. His goal was always to take Philadelphia, whether that be by destroying Washington's army and marching there, or sailing right to the city. When his attempts to lure Washington out failed, and Washington took up the defensive positions south of New Brunswick, Howe pulled the trigger on sailing to Philadelphia. He had his men construct transport craft and use the Royal Navy as an escort fleet. All the while, he had General Cornwallis continue to annoy and harass American forces to give the impression that they were staying until it was time to sail out. Howe did leave a sizable force in New York, but this was meant as a distraction force. It was large enough to hold the city on paper and to also potentially pose a threat, but the reality was that this force was just good enough to garrison the defenses, not much else. They were not in an offensive predisposition. He pulled off a total surprise move. When Howe landed in Maryland after traveling up the Chesapeake Bay in the river, he encountered small militia resistance and easily swept it aside. He landed 15,000 soldiers and began the march to Philadelphia. The American capital was about 55 miles or 88 kilometers away. He made great time, but was halted about 10 miles south of the capital by Washington's army, who had made a blistering march all the way down from New Jersey. In contrast to Howe's 15,000 men, Washington had 11,000 soldiers under his command. He deployed them on a long line along the Brandywine Creek, a superb defensive position blocking Howe's direct path towards the capital. Washington intended to make Howe pay dearly if he wanted to advance any farther. Washington had posted scouts all along the passes in and around Brandywine, but importantly, they were spread out and had trouble finding good sightlines given how foggy the weather was. In the morning, from across the river, British forces began to rain down fire upon the American lines. Both sides exchanged fire for a good amount of time, but the British did not make an advance head-on like Washington had anticipated. Instead, they were slowly spreading out towards his left flank. Washington deployed reinforcements and the battle lines began to stretch. A stalemate seemed to have settled in until a messenger rode up to Washington and, in a panic, said that the British army was headed right towards his right flank. Howe had his general Wilhelm von Kinfausen demonstrate in front of American lines and draw their attention while he marched a much larger force around Washington and passed over the river using the fog as cover. In a panic, Washington had to redeploy his men to his right flank, but as soon as they met the battle lines of the British, they began to crumble. At the same time, Kinfausen ordered a general attack across the whole battle line, and American lines collapsed all at once. Complete defeat was prevented, though, when Washington ordered Nathaniel Greene's division to hold in place and execute a fighting withdrawal. This maneuver preserved the army, and Washington retreated. The defeat at Brandywine left Philadelphia wide open, and indeed 2 weeks later, Howe marched into the rebel capital unopposed. The leaders of the fledgling nation had left a long time ago, but the prestige of entering the rebel capital was immense. However, Howe did not rest on his laurels. He instead deployed his forces in an arc north of the city and set up powerful strings of defenses. The linchpin of this was Germantown, where Howe stationed 9,000 men to control the Delaware River. Knowing that Howe had split his forces, Washington launched an all-out attack on Germantown to hopefully break the British defense. Washington created an extremely ambitious plan. His forces would split into 4 different columns that would all advance down different roads that all led into Germantown. They would all arrive in the morning and attack at the same time and surround the 9,000 British soldiers from all directions. They would either obliterate them or force a mass surrender. If this plan worked, this would be another Battle of Trenton. I would go ahead and argue that this plan being executed by a more professional force probably would have worked. I think it would have worked. But in the dusk of October 3rd, the American forces began their march in 4 columns. Due to the heavy fog, 3 of the 4 columns reached the battlefield, and they all arrived at separate times. The first, led by John Sullivan, arrived head-on and engaged the British forces in ruthless combat, and then began to make gains. The second column arrived, but confused their orders. Rather than charging the British camp, they stood afar and fired at it for a good amount of time. This was certainly one of the military attacks of all time. The third column got completely lost in the darkness, and then finally, Nathaniel Greene's division arrived at the battlefield behind Sullivan's. The only problem was that Sullivan's division was tired and had been fighting for hours. In the confusion, one of Greene's divisional commanders, a heavily intoxicated General Adam Stephen, ordered his men to fire at the British in front of him. As it were turned out, not only did he disobey orders and ordered an attack, he actually just shot the back of Sullivan's troops. They then turned around and shot at Nathaniel Greene's troops. And then the British counterattacked and drove the Americans from the field in its confusion. It was just a complete and utter catastrophe and quite a mess. In less than a month, the British had defeated George Washington twice and captured the rebel capital. This, by all means, was a successful campaign. But as things wrap up for the year, the British had lots to think about. They had captured the rebel capital, and in a normal war, that would have ended hostilities. But there seemed to be no chance of the Americans relenting. They had also just lost an entire army in Saratoga, and word was being received that France was considering joining the conflict on the American side. Going into 1778, there was a lot to think about. The Americans, too, had lots to consider. Washington had just lost 2 major battles in a row, and in contrast, General Horatio Gates had won the largest victory in the war in Saratoga. A minority in the Continental Congress now began to feel as if there was a need to change the leadership of the army. While defeated, Washington's forces had 2 massive silver linings. The army had conducted itself in a more professional manner than before, having fought toe-to-toe with the superior British force. And they also managed to escape 2 potential disasters and had the winter to prepare for future campaigns. For the winter, the British rested warm and well-fed. The Americans, though, retreated into the woods to a small village named Valley Forge. It was here, in the winter of 1777 and 1778, that the new American army would be built.